We're delighted to have Dr. Stoll with us this evening. And I want to let all of you know, if you don't know about the Institute, come to our website. It's just reformedinstitute.org. Learn more about what we are planning ahead for the future and join us for any of our programs that you're able to attend. On behalf of the Institute and its board, I want to invite one of the board members, Dr. Kent Myers, to introduce our speaker for this evening.
This is Kent Myers. I'm at the Old Presbyterian Meeting House in Alexandria, Virginia, on the board, as Larry said. And the Reformed Institute has done many programs where we look into the history of the Reformed tradition. But in addition, we want to bring it to the present concerns. And this work came up as being particularly interesting, and it's a shared interest of the local National Presbytery Earth Care Network and the Presbyterians for Earth Care. So if you're not in touch with those people, that's an excellent way to keep going on this theme, which is why should we be concerned about environmental matters at all? We search around for Bible verses and pick up in the normal course of things. But it was remarkable when I started to look at Dr. Stoll's book and say, we have a history, a very interesting history of environmental work. And in fact, so much of the early environmental action was religiously motivated. And this was completely news to me. So I think it'll be news to you, and I hope will be motivating. So I'd like to hear more. So thanks very much, Dr. Stoll.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to talk to you all. And I'm usually invited to speak to academic groups, so it's a pleasure to speak to Presbyterians. I too was raised Presbyterian, so I'm very much like, I didn't, as I started doing my research, I didn't expect, and I wasn't expecting that there was going to be a connection. But the more that I looked into, I got interested in, what is the religious background of major environmental figures in American history. That's how it started. And as I looked, I was like, one person after another was Presbyterian, until it was just like, how come nobody noticed this before? And it's like, this is not a secret. In a way, it's a secret because they didn't make a big deal of their Presbyterianism as adults, but clearly they're all coming out of the same, matrix. And so I was trying to figure out what it was about Presbyterianism that produced so many environmental figures was not easy. It was not obvious. Having grown up Presbyterian in conservative parts of the country, like Texas and Oklahoma, I can verify that Presbyterian Church is not a school for environmentalism. Yeah, and yet there is something, I don't know, maybe it's in that communion grape juice or something, I don't know. There's something there that was producing so many Presbyterians. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I found out that there was actually pretty deep theological reasons why, deep into the Reformed tradition, why both Congregationalists, the Church of the Puritans, and the Presbyterians were so deeply involved. So let's talk about that. All right, first of all, what I want to do is to give a very brief history of American environmentalism, so that you all have a kind of a basic idea of where we are and who these people are and what they're doing. First of all, we have conservation, which is a product of the middle 19th century in the United States. And this is a time period when we have the first city, state, and national parks being established. And this is also the time period when there are the first demands for conservation and forestry. It's also a period in the United States when we were doing anything but conserving and taking care of our forests. In the middle of the 19th century, we were cutting down forests absolutely as fast as we could, and people were growing quite alarmed. Beginning in 1889, lasting until 1920, we have what's known as the Progressive Era in uh, American history. Excuse me. This is when parks and conservation and forestry all became national causes, not just local ones or state ones. And this is when we have the National Park Service and National Forest Service organized as well. And after World War II, this is when we have the period that is we would call environmentalism. And this is when we expand our definition of conservation to include clean air, clean water, endangered species, toxic chemicals in the environment, toxic waste, and so on. And then from beginning in 1980 approximately to the present, we have seen the environmental movement just lose steam steadily. We see the rise of an anti-environmentalism in this period. It's also the period, I think, because of frustration. You see a lot of environmental radicalism. The Earth First group springs up in the 1980s and 1990s. We get Earth Liberation Front and all these other radical groups. Also, the development of eco-justice, which is kind of a new trend in environmental justice movement, a new trend in environmentalism, and the increasing national focus on having organic or local food. So, some positive things. But by and large, we see a major decline in political power and in legislative success. The number of important legal laws that are passed by Congress grow fewer and fewer until they just sort of disappear after about 1990. But what I found out was that there is a religious question here. If we look at 19th century conservation, middle of the 19th century, it's very odd that practically 100% of these people were no more than one generation away from a congregational church in the Connecticut River Valley, which is situated in Western New England. Congregational church, as I mentioned before, is the church founded by the Puritans in the 16 and 1700s. Progressive era, suddenly the Congregationalists disappear, and practically 100% are Presbyterians. This is also completely unexpected. So there's a complete transition, and as Presbyterians come in, they bring a very different ethic to the conservation movement. Then in the environmental era, we find that leading environmentalists were very often raised Presbyterian. And then the post-environmental era after 1980, Presbyterians disappear. The leadership shifts to other groups, mainly Catholics and Jews and African-American Baptists, and the Presbyterians vanish. We have no Presbyterian leaders in environmentalism who have been born after 1945, so they either die off. We're talking national leaders, people who are recognized, amongst environmentalists and by the public, immediately. So the question is, what's going on here? What explains this congregational and Presbyterian interest in preservation and conservation? And it's not like there are huge numbers of these people. If I look at this pie chart was devised after the census survey in 1906. The relative size, different denominations count their members differently. So they're not entirely to be relied upon as, exactly correct, but clearly Presbyterians and Congregationalists were a small portion of the American people in 1906. And today, of course, they're much, much smaller still. So let's go back and look at what it is these groups have in common. What is it in the Reformed tradition that's so influential? Let's look at Calvin himself. This is what I'm calling somewhat tongue-in-cheek green Calvinism. For Calvin, the universe itself is a theater for God's glory. Everywhere he's looking, he is seeing the glory of God all around him in the natural world. And he says in Book 5 of the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which is his magnum opus and one of the great classics of Christian literature. And if you are interested in reading more, chapter 5 is full of comments like this. The most perfect way of seeking God is for us to contemplate him in his works, whereby he renders himself near and familiar to us, and in some manner communicates himself. And there's another passage that I find is just delightful. You would never think that this was Calvin. You might think it was Emerson or somebody. It's in a preface to his cousin Olivetan, who translated the Bible, first Protestant Bible in French. And so his cousin Calvin wrote the preface, and in that preface he writes, "All creatures are able to act as witnesses and messengers of his glory to all men, to draw them to seek God, and having found him, to meditate upon him, and to render him homage, benefiting his dignity as so good, so mighty, so wise a Lord who is eternal. Yea, they are even capable of aiding every man wherever he is in this quest. For the little birds that sing, sing of God. The beasts clamor for him. The elements dread him. The mountains echo him. The fountains and flowing waters cast their glances at him, and the grass and flowers laugh before him." So I don't know if you've read Calvin or whatever you know about Calvin. You probably don't expect laughing flowers when you read Calvin. But basically in Calvin, we have what is really a profound providence that God sustains, he orders, he cares for, he guides all creatures and indeed everything in creation, so that everything in the universe, down to the smallest molecule and atom, is being directed by God. And this is a dramatic change from Catholicism, which has its theology is based on the Thomistic principle of the first mover, where God is the first mover of the universe, and he doesn't really need to do anything after that. So he's rather more remote from creation, the ongoing creation that we see around us every day, for a Catholic than he is for a Calvinist or a Reformed Protestant. So indeed, God is everywhere. The Spirit of God is everywhere at work wherever we look. And Calvinists also, Calvin not himself, not so much, but Calvinists after him would talk very much about one of their favorite phrases was the book of nature. This is an old Christian idea, it goes back to the 4th century. And the idea is that God would never lock away all knowledge of himself in a book written in ancient languages that very few people could read, then so would be accessible to the very few. In fact, God is accessible to everybody in the other thing that came directly from his hand. He's also the author of nature. And being the author of nature, he is also as good, as Calvin pointed out, his goodness, his power, his wisdom, his eternity, and indeed his existence are all visible wherever you look, so that everybody, these aspects of God are accessible to everyone. Of course, only in the Bible will you find the guide to salvation. That's in the Bible, but all this, you can learn about God from just looking at the book of nature. And you perhaps are familiar with many of these biblical sources that Calvin is using here. He refers to, I won't read all of these, and I will say, I'm using the King James Version. The King James Version and the Revised Standard are most familiar to me. They grew up with them. I know most people don't read those translations anymore, but to me, these are the words that are familiar to me. So I have a King James Version up there. But Romans 1:20, Psalm 19, the whole psalm, but of course the opening phrases, the heavens declare the glory of God. and the firmament showeth his handiwork. And Psalm 104 discusses in great detail the whole psalm, the wisdom and goodness of God in creation. Psalm 148 is where surely Calvin is getting his idea of the birds speaking of God, singing of God. In Psalm 108, all creatures praise the Creator. And then if you really want a really interesting passage, Job, chapters 38 to 41, discusses, this is where God speaks out of the whirlwind to Job. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, and so on, and discusses all of the things that he's involved in creation. So this is where the Reformed tradition is drawing from. Another aspect of Green Calvinism is the sort of a nostalgia for Eden. It was in Eden that Adam and Eve lived in harmony, not only with God, but with nature. And the great tragedy of the fall, which brought sin and death into the world, was that it distanced us so much from God and from nature. So there is amongst Calvinists repeated turn, it references to Eden. It is this sort of perfect world that we can never recapture again, and yet that is kind of the ideal. We want to return to our harmony with God and our harmony with the natural world. And the flip side of that is that everything that humans create is fallen. It is full of our vanity. It is full of our corruption. No matter what, so you're not going to find God um, in the works of man. These are all reflecting of our own desires and wishes and our own sins, and which it draws attention to the created, the creature, not to the creator. So um, there's nature and man kind of form this dichotomy. Fallen man, corrupted nature straight from the hand of God. And finally, Calvinism is where stewardship, the notion of stewardship, is first formulated. You look again in Calvin in his commentaries on Genesis, and he comments on Genesis 2:15, where man is put in the garden to till it and keep it. Calvin concludes from this passage that let him who possesses a field so partake of his yearly fruits that he may not suffer the ground to be injured by his negligence, but let him endeavor to hand it down to his posterity as he received it, or even better cultivated. Let everyone regard himself as the steward of God in all things which he possesses. So here we have this obligation to leave the land in a better situation than when we found it. So and again, the notion of stewardship is a Calvinist, it's a Calvinist notion. We have also kind of reinforcing this. Calvinists loved the Reformed tradition. Everywhere people seem to love the parable of the talents. I'll just briefly remind you the story. The story is a rich man goes out of town. He has 3 servants. He gives each of them a bit of money to take care of while he's gone. 2 of them invest it and increase the amount of money in the master's absence, and the 3rd servant is frightened of his master and so doesn't want to lose the money, so he buries it. And then all 3 of them bring when he returns, bring what they've got. And the master, of course, is well pleased with the first 2 servants and casts the 3rd one out into the outer darkness. So the parable of the talents, whatever we have, we are supposed to develop and improve. And one of the things that you will find in, say, Puritan, both on both sides of the Atlantic, Puritan sermons and writings all the time is the idea of improvement. Improving not only our land that we have, but improving ourselves spiritually, intellectually, morally, in every possible way. Improve everything. So this is, God has given us certain things into our possession, and it is our duty to make them better. So again, that feeds into the notion of improving your land, or it's kind of a conservation ethic. Just briefly for those of you who are not too, haven't taken American history in a long time, the Puritans settled in New England, which is the map on the left. That's colonial New England and the states, originally colonies that are now the states of New England. That's Massachusetts and Connecticut mainly, but also Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. And you'll see on the right-hand map where the Puritans most thickly colonized, and I have circled out the Connecticut River Valley in particular, which runs up through the middle of Connecticut and into western Massachusetts and on up on the border between Vermont and New Hampshire. It is here, as you see, there's quite a few people settling there. It's a very fertile area. And it also remains very conservative, the most Calvinist part of New England. And Boston, being on the eastern coast and the areas that are influenced by it and by Harvard, moves slowly into a more liberal direction. And when the Puritans get kind of disgusted with this liberalism around 1700, they move over to the Connecticut River Valley and establish Yale, which became a bastion of Calvinism well into the 19th century. So we are talking about the more conservative part of New England as being the cradle of 19th century conservation. So the Puritans came to New England and set up towns that were meant to be just, equitable, and sustainable, as well as godly. That they preached to each member of society that we had moral duties we had a moral duty to be useful and productive to other people. We were not put here on earth for ourselves. We were put here to benefit other people and to use our talents, improve them so that society itself is improved and that God may be glorified. You can see this in the layout of a typical Puritan town. But you could see here these. Let's see. I think I can get a laser pointer. Do you see the laser pointer? Okay, great. So here we have the roads, and you see the different plots of land that are given to each member of each family. The lots are extremely long and narrow. One of the purposes of this is to keep people in community. So New England is very much different from all of the other colonies where everybody lives out on their own little piece of land all by themselves. The Puritans are like, we're not put here for ourselves. We are put here to benefit everybody else. So they believed in community, not living for oneself. The other reason for having all these long lots is so that no one person monopolizes all the best land. By having long lots, you have some of the worst land as some of the good land that you can give to everybody. Another thing the Puritans did so that there would be no poverty in their towns, they gave everybody a piece of land. Everybody on the social scale. But poverty was a creation of sin, the sin of greed by the more avaricious members of society, which would leave some people in poverty. So they wanted to prevent that as much as possible and a person cannot improve themselves and improve society, use their talents for the benefit of society if they're struggling to feed themselves and their family. So to allow people to use their talents as God wished them to be used, poverty had to be eliminated, which is, I find, a fascinating, interesting. There's no other society in the New World, in all of the colonies, was built like this, nor any of the old societies in Europe. Another thing they did was here's all of these little plots in red all belong to the same person. The reason for this was that a farmer in those days needed lots of different kinds of land in order to sustain himself. So he needs of course, a plot of land to farm is arable, and he's going to need animals to farm that. So he's going to need cattle and horses, and so he's going to need a pasture. He's also going to need hay to feed his animals over the long New England winter, and so he's going to need some hay ground. He's also going to need a woodlot because everybody in those, it's very cold. You're going to need lots of wood for fires. You also need wood for all your various buildings, farm buildings, and so on. The wood was essential for farming, and fences was essential for farming in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. And another thing that you needed the hay for was your animals were going to be cooped up in a barn all winter. You're going to need to feed them. You also collected the manure, and then you would spread it on your arable land in the spring, creating this cycle, which was, in theory, pretty indefinitely sustainable. So it's just ecologically sustainable society. It's quite fascinating, kind of as an experiment. Here we have a photograph of a late 19th century or a 19th century New England town. You see, this is just part of it, but here you see the church, and then along the road you see all the houses next to one another. So here's by 1830-ish, our New England towns are beginning to look very much like their classic form. But we have already a notion of conservation here, that you must preserve God's gifts for the benefit of future generations, which means to use your land and leave your, don't cut down all the timber on your timber lot and make a big profit from it, because the next person that comes along and owns your land will have nothing. Will have no wood. And so each town passed laws regulating how people use their lands and use their timber. I mean, it's one thing to preach these things from the pulpit, but these are Calvinists. They don't trust people to be good. Some of us are going to be good, but the people who are not good are going to make the community poorer in the future. And so therefore laws have to be passed. So it's definitely a tradition here of using government power to promote conservation in the future, the good of future generations. So they don't just rely on the pulpit, in other words. So here we get conservation is first formulated in a internationally important work by a man named George Perkins Marsh, Man and Nature in 1864, the first real codification of conservation and why it works, looking at its ecological effects and so on. And he is indeed a Congregationalist from Vermont, right there in the Connecticut Valley. To him, the New England town, the orderly New England town, was a moral exemplar for the rest of the nation as it's moving west. He wanted the New England town to be recreated as America moved west and westward. He thought if this would be great if we could move westward in the same way that New England was settled. This was, of course, wishful thinking. It would be settled the way the rest of the colonies were, which was individuals on their own plots of land. But he was hoping to save the New England town. But at the same time, he was dismayed to see the New England town disintegrating. Market pressures were forcing farmers to use their land in unsustainable ways. They couldn't make a living by basically subsistence farming. And as cheap grain was coming in from the West, they could not produce grain so cheaply, and so they would stop producing grain. And in other words, they were desperate to make some money some other ways, so they began to cut down their timber. They began to, as you can see, there's a couple of illustrations of a New England farm in 1740. And then by 1830, the land is getting exhausted, and you can see it's been almost completely deforested. And as he's watching this happen, he's incredibly dismayed. It's going to leave the whole land impoverished for the next generation. And so he wrote Man and Nature. So we'll see that forestry is taken up as a cause by people who have roots in the Congregational Church. And in fact, we looked at the Forest Service, which is created, inspired by Marsh's book, The Forest Service, which was originally the Forest Division in the Department of Agriculture, was created, and then in the about 1880. And of the first 6 heads of the what would become the National Forest Service, 5 of them have roots in a Connecticut Valley Congregational Church, which I thought was fascinating. And the second director was in himself an ordained congregational minister, Nathaniel Eggleston. Parks too come out of the New England tradition. Every town had kept common lands for the use of everyone. This is again unique in the colonial era. You'll find commons in no other colony. Everything was privatized. And so in the 19th century, as the commons began to lose uh, their economic value, towns began to beautify them, and they basically gradually became the first parks. And then New Englanders, as they began to move west into New York City, into other cities, brought the idea that, hey, these are really nice places that can be used by everybody, owned by the community for community purposes and to benefit the community. And so the advocates of parks then spread out. The first really important one would be Frederick Law Olmsted, who was raised in Hartford, Connecticut, from an old Puritan family, who would be chosen to design and build New York's Central Park, which would be the first park created in America for this first urban park, really the first park. And it's created by public funds rather than by private interests. And it has the purpose of being democratic. It's a social and a moral benefit for the community, where people in the crowded city, particularly the lower classes, could get out of the crowded city and draw themselves close to works of nature and have the moral influence and religious influence of being in a kind of a semi-natural surroundings while living in a crowded city. It would be New Englanders too who would be instrumental in the creation of a park in Yosemite, which would eventually be a national park, but it was given to the state of California in 1864, and then the first national park in 1872, which would be Yellowstone. Again, you'll find people with roots in the Connecticut River Valley who are everywhere involved in the creation of Yellowstone. Okay, so where are the Presbyterians? Presbyterians will bring a different kind of ethic and different mentality to America as they immigrate over. Here we have to turn back to John Knox. This is a statue of John Knox in Edinburgh, in his church where he's preached, St. Giles. Oh, by the way, that stained glass window that I had on my slide of the parable of the talents, I took in St. Giles Cathedral, which I thought was very appropriately located. John Knox was not a theologian. He did not write very much, but he was a powerful preacher. He, on several occasions, caused riots with his sermons. He could bring the powerful to their knees. The Queen of Scots was brought to tears by John Knox on occasion. So he says, and I wish I had a really good Scottish accent to read this, but I think not going to embarrass anybody, but I'll just use my American accent. For considering myself rather called of God to instruct the ignorant, comfort the sorrowful, confirm the weak, and rebuke the proud by tongue and lively voice in these most corrupt days, than to compose books for the age to come. God made my tongue a trumpet to forewarn realms and nations, yea, certain great personages of translations and changes. There is in this traditional Presbyterianism a very strong element of thus saith the Lord certainty. And Presbyterians could be extremely moralistic and extremely censorious of others. hence John Knox bringing Mary Queen of Scots to tears, and extremely self-righteous, at least from the point of view of other people. Um, and as he describes the the mood at the time of the Reformation in Scotland, because he's Scottish. He's a friend of John Calvin. He had been in Geneva, but he was Scottish, came back to Scotland and started the Reformation there, and Presbyterian Church got established. As he said, the preachers were wondrous vehement in reprehension of all manner of vice, especially avarice, oppression of the poor, excess, riotous cheer, banqueting, immoderate dancing, and whoredom. I mean, don't imagine that in a great Scottish accent and you get Scottish Presbyterian preaching. So there is a legacy here in Presbyterianism in Scotland and as Presbyterians came to America, in America, of powerful preaching, of a sense of righteousness, and that righteousness must be extended to the nation, and a willingness to engage in politics, which we have here with his the my tongue a lively trumpet to forewarn realms and nations and certain great personages. As a freedom to engage in pointing out the sins of the powerful. But also it's interesting in his list of vices. What is first in the vices? But avarice and oppression of the poor. This comes next. And we finally get down to whoredom. And I think that if you listen to contemporary evangelicals, their list of vices is going to be in the opposite order, don't you think? And they probably won't get to the oppression of poor and avarice at all. But for Presbyterians, these were socially destructive. They're harmful to the common good. And so as this creates a powerful motive to restrain the wealthy, which you'll see in the progressive era amongst all these Presbyterians. Another thing that's very important is that the Presbyterians have a problem with their relationship with the state. It is the state church in Scotland, the Presbyterian Church, but the church had a tendency, in the opinion of many preachers and lay people, of making the church made too many compromises with the state. And so the more uncompromising of the church members would grow dissatisfied. Unfortunately, the Presbyterian system organized in presbyteries is also a perfect setup for schism. You just get a presbytery that's very dissatisfied and it breaks off and decides it's going to become its own church. And so the Presbyterian religious landscape was littered with all these small church groups, the Covenanters, the Burgher Presbyterians, the anti-Burgher Presbyterians, the New Light Presbyterians, the Old Light Presbyterians, the Seceders, also divided into New and Old Lights. The anti-Burgher and the Burghers would be divided into New Light and Old Light. And then there would be the United Presbyterians and then the Free Presbyterian churches by the mid-19th century. And as these immigrants came to the United States, they brought their schisms with them. They didn't make any sense here because there was no relationship between the church and the state. But one of the denominations in particular I'm going to point out is the United Presbyterians, not exactly the same as the current United Presbyterian Church, but one of the ancestor groups. And in the 19th and early 20th century, they were very, very Scottish, held very tightly to the Westminster Confession, pure Calvinist, and the Scottish Psalter, which means they weren't going to be singing hymns. And they also had a socially liberal approach, attitude, supporting abolition, for example. So it's an interesting group, the United Presbyterians. One of the things this does was cause concerned Presbyterians to look for something to bring these groups together. And they found this in natural theology, which is the idea of looking at nature for attributes of God. We can all agree that a religion based on nature, all of us will accept that. And so the 19th century in Scotland and among Scots in the United States is the heyday of natural theology, popular natural theology. Lots and lots of people are reading it. It also produces lots of natural scientists, because if you've got lots of people interested in looking at nature, they will, of course, begin to come up with new ideas about botany and uh, geology and all sorts of sciences. So early 19th century British science is absolutely dominated by Scots, and the great scientific and uh, natural theology and religious centers in Scotland would be the universities of Glasgow and Edinburgh. This natural theology would also be popular in England, but it was really popular in America. And there's a great example of this in John Muir's, John Muir. John Muir is the Scottish American early advocate, very, very powerful advocate for national parks in the late 19th century and early 20th century. He was brought over by his family to America to homestead in Wisconsin in he was born in 1838 and would have been 11 or so when he came over. His father was extremely religious and was a bit of a lay preacher. Never had his own congregation, but he was willing to preach to anybody. And John Muir remembers one night when the Northern Lights were particularly spectacular, where he jumps up and runs out and shouts to everyone, "Come, come, mother, come, bairns, and see the glory of God. All the sky is clad in a robe of red light. Look straight up to the crown where the foals are gathered. Hush and wonder and adore, for surely this is the clothing of the Lord himself, and perhaps he will even now appear looking down from his high heaven." You can just imagine this immigrant on the frontier with his Scottish accent, um, producing basically natural theology. So, it's everywhere. You'll find it all over America. So the Presbyterians they begin to appear in the late 19th century. We have our first, one of the first Presbyterian presidents. I think there's only one or two before that, and not particularly religious, but Benjamin Harrison was extremely religious. And he appoints as a Secretary of Interior, John Noble, another Presbyterian. And under them, we have the first expansion of the national parks and also the translation of forestry into law. There was the first additional park since 1872 with Yellowstone, when Sequoia National Park and Yosemite National Park were added, 1890. And then for 1891, the Forestry Reserve Act was passed to empowering the president to reserve public lands from sale and from use. And so preserving our forest from being cut down, from clear cutting. So he, by an act of his pen, takes 22 million acres of forest out and preserves them. He is succeeded by the son of a Presbyterian minister, Grover Cleveland, and his Presbyterian Secretary of the Interior, Hoke Smith. And Grover Cleveland, too, against great political opposition, reserves another 27 million acres of forest land. And then 8 years later, we get Theodore Roosevelt, who was raised Presbyterian. He would belong to a number of different churches as an adult, but his upbringing was definitely Presbyterian. And he is just sort of outdoes them all, adding 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 150 national forests, which he renames from forest reserves. They are reorganized as national forests under him. And it's the idea of another young man raised Presbyterian. His name is Gifford Pinchot, who was the first director of the Forest Service, which was organized in 1905. Roosevelt also hosted this was Pinchot's idea, hosted the Governor's Conference on Conservation in 1908, which popularized and made a political uh, power out of the idea of conservation. So conservation for the next half a century would be the dominant idea in the proper American relationship with the natural world from the government. One more Presbyterian. Again, his father was a Presbyterian minister. This is Woodrow Wilson, and his Presbyterian Secretary of the Interior, Franklin Lane. Franklin Lane was the leader here, not Wilson. And under him, he would organize the National Park Service in 1916, and 8 national parks would be added. So you can see under this remarkable string of Presbyterian presidents, and we wouldn't have any more Presbyterian presidents after Woodrow Wilson. So it's kind of a remarkable period in American history. The progressive era is really a Presbyterian era. And I would love to kind of write a book about that because it's far more than just conservation. But you can see that there's this creation of this foundation for the national park system and the national forest system under both of under these Presbyterians. I said there's no more Presbyterians. This is not technically true. Apparently, Donald Trump was raised Presbyterian, but I've seen very little evidence of that myself. But that's my observation. All right, certainly nothing like these guys. And you can see, I'm just going to give a couple examples here of the Presbyterianness of these men. Roosevelt, in particular, was called repeatedly by lots of people a preacher of righteousness. He's an incredibly moralistic president. It saw a moral aspect in everything. And of course, he's famous for having said the presidency was such a bully pulpit. So no wonder he preaches. And as he says about conservation, natural resources must be used for the benefit of all our people and not monopolized for the benefit of the few. We face the great central task of leaving this land and even a better land for our descendants than it is for us. Conservation is a great moral issue. And again, as you can recognize, that's almost straight from Calvin. I want to give just a quotation or two about and from John Muir. That's John Muir, of course, standing next to Theodore Roosevelt in Yosemite Valley. You see the Yosemite Falls in the distance behind them. They're standing at, I think, Glacier Point, the famous photograph. Muir saw himself as an evangelist for God's works of nature. And during the 1870s, as he was really kind of developing his message and practically living full time in the Sierras, his friend, the painter William Keith, his best friend, who was also Scottish, brought over at age 11 by his family to America, commented on him at the time. He's like, we almost thought he was Jesus Christ. We fairly worshiped him. And he had just had this persona, this charisma as a young man, and he preached, and he could really inspire. He definitely felt himself also to be an interpreter of the landscape. He was reading the book of nature. He said God had carved these mountains by glaciers. And so he was reading God's glacial manuscripts, as he put it. That they can also see his moralistic preaching. This is a lovely quotation, a very famous quotation from John Muir. He said, national parks have always been the subject to attack by despoiling gain seekers and mischief makers of every degree from Satan to senators, eagerly trying to make everything immediately and selfishly commercial. This will go on as part of the universal battle between right and wrong. This is what conservation is about, right and wrong. Their arguments are curiously like those of the devil, devised for the destruction of the first garden, so much of the very best eaten fruit going to waste. These temple destroyers, devotees of ravaging commercialism, seem to have a perfect contempt for nature, and instead of lifting their eyes to the God of the mountains, lift them to the almighty dollar. So, yes, this power of preaching is very politically effective. I think that this is one of the things that sets the Presbyterians apart is that it is a training, not so much for environmentalism. It gives you the kind of moral superiority of nature, but also gives you the tools to be effective in the political arena. Let me just hit, as I'm running out of time, a few of the major Presbyterian environmentalists. Rachel Carson, of course, wrote her famous Silent Spring, published her famous Silent Spring in 1962, which was a very moralistic attack on the overuse of pesticides. Very powerful because she's a very, very scientifically informed. Attack on the overuse of pesticides promoted by an alliance between corporations and government, which would often be said to be the book that sparked the 60s environmental movement. I will say something about Rachel Carson. She was raised in the United Presbyterian Church, and her grandfather and her uncle were both Presbyterian ministers. So she comes by her abilities quite naturally. Another one would be a man that perhaps you don't remember anymore. His name is David Brower. He was very active in environmentalism from 1940s all the way through the 80s and beyond until his death in the early part of this century. And he was the Sierra Club executive director from 1952 to 69, making the Sierra Club bring it from a regional hiking organization to a national environmental powerhouse that it is still today. For him, in a way, environmentalism was his religion, as he kind of put it. But he also said that what the Creator made was not ours to wantonly destroy. And he's very, very effective. Not besides being incredibly charismatic, he was just this effective speaker. He'd been compared to Billy Graham in his speaking ability. Again, we have this preacherness. Instrumental in establishment of Kings Canyon, Redwood National Parks, North Cascades, Great Basin, and Point Reyes, Cape Cod, and Fire Island National Seashores. And he was the major figure that stopped dams being built in Dinosaur National Monument and Grand Canyon National Park. As a footnote, I'll just mention he's nominated 3 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. So he's a pretty important guy. Another guy is kind of interesting, a bit of an outlier in this, but worth mentioning is Edward Abbey, a writer who was a passionate defender of pristine wilderness against greedy developers. Again, we see this sort of defending nature against avarice, kind of against fallen man kind of attitude. His mother, by the way, was the organist in their local Presbyterian church. Both he and Rachel Carson are from Western Pennsylvania, which is an area that was settled in the colonial era by more Presbyterians than anywhere else. And still today, there's more Presbyterian churches per capita in Western Pennsylvania than there is anywhere else in the country. He is known as Edward Abbey as the author of Desert Solitaire, The Monkey Ranch Gangs, and many other books. And his passion and his uncompromisingness inspired Earth First and other radical environmental groups. I could go on about many environmental figures. I've listed them here so that I don't have time to talk about all of them. Robert Underwood Johnson was they're all Presbyterian raised. Robert Underwood Johnson was a national magazine editor who was John Muir's closest ally. Alice Hamilton wanted to be a medical missionary as a young woman, but she became a doctor, the first woman to teach at Harvard Medical School, and environmental medicine would be her great contribution. Harold Ickes would be Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior. I have an asterisk by his name because he intended to be a Presbyterian minister. It never worked out that way, but that was, he desired to be a Presbyterian minister early in his career. and later on would be a very influential, again, many more new national parks and so on, was the man who actually desegregated national parks in the 1930s. William O. Douglas would be known as the environmentalist justice on the Supreme Court. His father was a Presbyterian minister. I have listed three famous nature writers, nature poets, excuse me, Robinson Jefferson, Robert Frost, W.S. Merwin, and again, Jefferson, Merwin have asterisks because their fathers were Presbyterian ministers. Jane Jacobs, who argued for livable cities and was the one that stopped Robert Moses from running a freeway through Washington Park in New York City. Lynn White Jr. was the man who wrote an essay in 1967 that sparked interest in what was the responsibility of the churches for the environmental crisis. Were they responsible, or can they marshal the Christian tradition to, protect the environment? And again, his father was a very influential Presbyterian minister. Archie Carr was a major mid-20th century conservationist, especially active in sea turtles. And his father was a Presbyterian minister. Ian McHarg was um, um, an architect and a landscape architect, wrote a very influential book called Design with Nature, came out in 1970. Again, his father wanted to be a Presbyterian minister, but never was able to. John McPhee, another Presbyterian coming out of Princeton, of all places, which was originally the first Presbyterian seminary in America. John McPhee, of course, famous, the Pulitzer Prize winning author of many, many books on nature and the natural world. Holmes Ralston III is the man who is known for founding the field of environmental ethics. He is an ordained Presbyterian minister, and he is son and grandson of Presbyterian ministers, so he gets two asterisks. John Denver, another boy raised Presbyterian, of course, famous for his Rocky Mountain High and many other popular songs with nature as themes. And then Annie Dillard, the Pulitzer Prize winning author of Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, also from Western Pennsylvania, and raised Presbyterian. So we have so many examples. And further down, the scale of fame and power you get, there's still, it's people locally all over the place. You keep finding, after I wrote my book, people would email me with, "Oh, I found this Presbyterian." It's like, they're everywhere. But just to finish off really quickly, Presbyterians, as I mentioned earlier, Presbyterians have been missing from the national environmental leadership since about 1980. No major leader in environmentalism has been Presbyterian. No major, how shall I phrase it? No major leader who was Presbyterian was born since 1945. And this, I think, shows in the power of the environmental movement. The environmental movement misses its Presbyterians. We have had, since 1990, no national environmental legislation of any importance, unless you count the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 with um, uh, its support for dealing with climate change. There seems to be so little political will to nationally to tackle really important issues like global warming or pollution in the oceans, or you name it, plastics. And today, the strongest denominations are evangelicals and Pentecostals, who I cannot name a single environmental leader who comes out of those churches. But again, we have many positive personal and local actions. We see lots of churches, for example, Presbyterian churches, putting up solar panels on the roofs and doing all sorts of local actions, and individual Presbyterians getting involved, creating and protecting local parks and so on. But this is, of course, not going to do much to help us solve those big national and internet global problems that we face today. So I see that I've gone over time. I apologize for that. So let me just wrap up with this photo of me next to the wall of the Reformation in Geneva. And there we're looking at Farel and Calvin, and second on the left, and then Bezos, and then our friend John Knox on the far right. And that guy who's second is left, he's the guy who's talking about the waters reflecting God's glory and the singing flowers and so on. So thank you very much.
That was remarkable, Dr. Stoll. Obviously, just a piece of the remarkable research and writing you have done over the years. If you would like to send up a note of applause for Dr. Stoll, there's a little emoji you can use. Yes, excellent, excellent. I encourage others to do the same. Hey, to everyone, we're very, very grateful for this opportunity to be together.